And society doesn't want man to be free.
Society does not want man
to be free, because freedom means, according to socials, freedom means disorder. Revolt means disorder. Revolution means disorder. But man is always seeking freedom. But freedom merely outwardly, in relation to the social structure. Therefore, he is a revolt against society, but not revolt against the inner psychological structure which has created this society.
Let's not blame Enoch. We need to blame Cyril. Cyril is the real villain behind South Africa's budget disaster. South Africa is on the brink of financial collapse, and there's one man to blame, Cyril Ramaphosa. Not the finance minister, not the coalition partners, but the so-called great deal maker himself. Yeah, right. Cyril has been missing in action while the economy crumbles, and it's time we call him out. So let's look at the facts. The budget speech, a cornerstone of governance, was delayed in an unprecedented blunder. Why? Because the ANC-led coalition couldn't agree on the numbers 2 hours before it went live. South Africa's growth is at 0.8%, and the forecast is a pathetic 1.8%, lower than Britain during its economic meltdown in 1976. Government spending continues to rise, while tax revenues shrink. The top taxpayers already fund 25% of personal income tax, and now they want a wealth tax on top of that. The country is drowning in debt, with borrowing escalating to cover bloated public sector wages and failing state-owned enterprises. Madness. Corruption, inefficiency, and vanity projects drain state funds, while businesses suffocate under red tape and crumbling infrastructure. Well done, ANC. The ANC is living in a fantasy where they think they can tax and spend their way out of a crisis. Public spending is out of control, and redistribution is prioritized over wealth creation. Typical ANC. The environment is increasingly hostile to businesses and wealth creators, pushing capital and talent out of the country. The ANC refuses to take responsibility. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana was thrown under the bus. But Ramaphosa is the real culprit. And the coalition, the government we have, was supposed to introduce stability. But instead it has become a circus of indecision and incompetence. If South Africa doesn't course correct now, an IMF bailout is inevitable. We need a full change of direction. And why aren't more people talking about this? How long before South Africa becomes a full-blown failed state, like our northerly neighbor? And what happens when the tax base finally collapses and there's no one left to foot the bill? This is not just another budget failure. It's a sign that the ANC has no plan, no vision, and no capacity to lead. The path forward is actually simple. Enoch, stop the reckless spending and scrap non-essential government departments like the Department of Small Business Development. Sell off half our overseas embassies. Cut corruption, enforce accountability, and privatize the failing state-owned enterprises. How often do we have to say that? Reduce tax burdens and simplify regulations to make South Africa an attractive place for investment and entrepreneurship. If nothing changes, South Africa will be forced into IMF control, losing its economic sovereignty. Maybe that's not a bad thing. But if we act now, there's still time to turn this around, and for South Africa to become a thriving, investment-friendly economy. Wouldn't we like that? Spineless Cyril needs to stop hiding and start leading. South Africa needs economic reforms, not political excuses. And whether Cyril likes it or not, time is running out.
Welcome to another episode of Wake Us Up in the Hood. I am your host Marshall, and today we came across another video of our uncle, our beautiful, can I say beautiful? Or must I say handsome? But nevertheless, the very interesting character that all of us know as Rob HERSOV. And given the speech you just heard him make, or made, should I say. It is very concerning seeing the number of people who commented. I don't want to say in a positive light, but from the context of his perspective or perception, it could be considered positive. But from the opposition view, where I perceive myself to be, those comments are really negative. Why do I say negative? Because it clearly indicates that they are not able to think critically. They do not have the capacity to use their brains, because they were not able to discern that Uncle Rob is complaining that South Africa does not have a very business-friendly environment. But with the same breath, he is saying that they need to cut departments like small business development. So what in essence is Uncle Rob saying? That those of us who aspire to become business people who are not yet there, business is not for us. It is only for the well-established elites that are already there, right? And he's also advocating for us to privatize all state-owned entities, which means me, you, the average person, the 99%, do not have the financial capacity to buy any of these so-called failed state entities. So to who is it gonna be privatized to? Who is going to own it? And I thought, okay, I've been contemplating for 3 days now whether I should make this video or not. Or rather not whether I should make it. I knew already that I want to make it. My contemplation and dilemma was more on the approach, execution thereof, or delivery. So I thought, let me, as a colored, a black person according to the Constitution, let me not be the one to argue with the statements Uncle Rob is making and to prove how he lacks in intellectual capacity, because it can only be, again, like I said in a previous video, one of two things. Either he's really stupid, or he knows what he's doing and has an agenda for why he's pushing what he's pushing. Without any further ado, I'm going to play you some videos. And again, the reason why I wanted to do this is to speak specifically to those people who want to look down on communism, who wants to look down on socialism, who praises capitalism as the only system that has produced wealth, progression, and all the positives for the economy. However, again, like one of the people I will be showcasing video clips of, will indicate that these capitalists do not take into account the data. They do not take into account the actual reality on the ground. They look at numbers on the screen as an indicator whether this economy is doing well or not. But then again, what I'm about to share, I'm for sure certain that this is gonna go over many people's heads once more, especially those religious people and those people who consider themselves capitalists. So, like I said, let me not share too much of my own opinion. Let the white people speak, because as we have been conditioned in this country, white is right and white is might. So, let the white people speak on our behalf and explain why capitalism is bad for this planet and it's bad for humanity. And again, the people I'm going to be showcasing you are economists and not business people. People who have studied the economy. I doubt that Rob HERSOV is an economist, because should he have studied the economy, he would have come to the same conclusion as these economists did. And here is where I would like to correct myself, because I, in one of the previous videos, said that there is no economist in this world that is able to see the problem and try and fix it, because economists, like lawyers, like doctors, like all these professions, they are not here to improve the system. They are here to uphold the institutions that oppress us in the system. But to my surprise, here are two profound economists. One of them is a multi-millionaire. And how did he become a multi-millionaire? By betting on the decline of the economy. And not just the economy, the life standard of the average living person. Like the you and the me who are not in possession of generational wealth. Us who don't have a stake in the economy. Us who do not move chess pieces on this monopoly board. The decline of our living standards. And this person goes by the name of Gary Stevenson. And I'm not sure if some of you have heard of him, but he is now slowly growing momentum because of getting exposure on different platforms. And here I'm going to also give him exposure. You know, hopefully you that comprehend the message that he's trying to share will also share this message with other people, so that eventually the 99% of us, where in terms of real democracy, this will be a test for us now. If democracy is a numbers game,
this is what it's fundamentally about. All the hypocrisy about transparency and democracy and bullshit like that, it's all bullshit.
then we, the 99% who is being oppressed, whose value is being extracted and sucked without our consent and diverted to the top 1%. If we realize what the problem is in this economy and take the corrective action as a collective, then we might turn things around. Right? And again, I also want to highlight this particular point, because this is a result of education. Once you are an educated person, you struggle to grasp concepts that is outside of your frame of education. And some people, when I tell them that, they take it as an insult. It's just a fact. You know, like gravity. If I leave this mouse, 100 out of 100%, it's gonna fall to the ground due to the effects of gravity. And again, like I said, this universe operates on laws and not man-made rules that change however they feel like it needs to change. Laws. So when I let go of this mouse, it's gonna go down 100% of the time. Alright? Now, what am I trying to say with relation to education and the framework of thinking of education? This is precisely what I observed in Gary and Mr. Wolf, these two economists that I'm going to share with you. Yes, they are awake enough to be able to detect that something is seriously wrong, and they are getting pushback when they want to bring solutions. And the problem that I'm observing with their solution is still within the framework of their education. Hence, they are being rejected by their peers who have the same education. Their peers are not awake enough to detect the problem, whereas they are. So now when they share a solution, which is still within the framework. And again, here is where, when I say our language is not developed enough. Because now he's using the same language that is in his framework to motivate or to argue his solution, which is rejected because the terms he's using, they already have a certain experience with those terms. So when he speaks, these people hear those terms according to their experience, not by how they want to bring across the message. Therefore, these people do not understand them when they talk about a solution. And again, the solution, again, that they would bring to the table still fits within the framework of their education, within the framework of our current institutions, right? Where I am saying is that the whole system needs to be abolished. And when we speak about the economy, talking about capitalism, talking about socialism, I'm talking about communism, fascism, feudalism, Marxism, all the isms within this framework needs to be abolished and a totally new system, and not new as in the sense that we now have to create it, new as in there's already one based on laws created by God. We just now need to follow and abide by that so that everyone, each and every stakeholder, even capitalists, even people who consider themselves capitalists, can now live a productive and a beneficial experience within the economy. And again, when we abolish the system, we must abolish the term economy as well. And I'm advocating for a term such as a resource management system, because you will hear people like Gary, the economist, say that we don't need money to stay alive. The human body doesn't consume money to live another day. The human body needs healthy food and clean drinking water and shelter to protect it. That is what we need. And we've created a system that puts money as an obstacle for us to be able to access food, clean drinking water, and shelter to live as human beings. But then again, now I'm already past the limit. Let me just give you Gary. Let me give you the economist. And I also am going to share with you one TikTok video. And these are all white people. So, because we have been conditioned with this mentality that white is right, so after this, I'm not expecting any pushback. What I'm expecting is, let's have dialogue. Let's discuss how are we going to move forward. How do we construct this new system? And how is it going to work for all of us? So let's have a look at these people.
Because in a country with the highest inequality rates in the world, their plan is not to decrease it, their plan is to increase it. So either we're going to have the EFF coming to power, or we're going to have an unled revolution. And the reason I say that is because the DA's economic policy and what their plan is with the ANC is absolutely terrifying.
Could you just expand on that?
So they want to institute a measure which is basically privatize everything, privatize all of our services. And we know from historical examples that that doesn't work. So we know Russia in the 1990s decided to privatize everything after the fall of communism.
Yeah.
And the reason it doesn't work is that there's only a handful of people in a country who have enough wealth to be able to buy up the government privatized industries. Because there's not going to be 20 new ESCOMs. There's going to be one ESCOM, but it's going to be owned by a billionaire.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that you create a monopoly. So competition doesn't exist within this sort of capitalist system, because you're going to have one person that's a rich guy in charge of ESCOM, one person that's a rich guy in charge of our water. And instead of these entities now being accountable to the people as their government agencies, they're going to be accountable to profit holders. So these companies are going to run services for nothing else but profit.
Yeah.
Raising the prices on everything, like we saw in the UK when they privatized their transport industry. It got worse and prices went up. And what we're going to see in South Africa is that when people already can't afford electricity, no one's going to be able to afford.
One, welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we are going to talk about the tax burden. Alright, so this is an economic story which comes up a lot in the news, which is the idea that at the moment the tax burden is at an all-time historic high. Now, I'm pretty sure this is basically a factual truth, and it's something that when it first started to get mentioned, it kind of confused me a little bit, and I think it would have confused a lot of people. The reason it confused me is because we have two things happening simultaneously, which kind of appear to be like paradoxically impossible, which is number one, you have the tax burden at an all-time high. And that's true. You know, you guys will see that, especially things like council tax rising really significantly. And at the same time, we have this situation where basically all government services seem to be, you know, collapsing simultaneously. Everything seems to be constantly in crisis. NHS is in crisis, education is in crisis, especially things like local services are in crisis. So how can it be possible that on the one hand, taxes are the highest they've ever been, and on the other hand, government services are like the worst they've ever been, or they've been in decades? You know, taxes pay for government services, so if taxes are super high, how can government services be super terrible? And, you know, the reason which is often given for this, and I think it's really increased the popularity of the idea, that is basically that government is corrupt. Government is corrupt, so we pay loads of taxes, government pisses the taxes up the wall, you know, let's get rid of taxes, let's get rid of government services. And I think, you know, there probably is some truth to this. I think there's probably always been some degree of government corruption. You know, government corruption may well be higher now than it has been historically. You know, if you look at some of the things that happened during COVID, some of the sort of Conservative Party scandals, it does look like corruption is increasing. But, you know, I'm not an expert on the levels of government corruption. I don't work in government. But I've been sitting and thinking about this for a while. I don't think it's enough to say that corruption has suddenly increased massively. And the more I thought about this, the more I realised there is another really obvious factor which basically never gets discussed, which I want to explain to you today, which explains really well basically why the tax burden has increased and probably will continue to increase despite the fact that government services are collapsing. Okay, I think the best way to explain this is to use an example. Imagine you own completely your own house. No mortgage, no rent, you own your own house. Some of you will be in that position, most of you won't be in that position. Now imagine you are in that position. How expensive will your life be? Well, for most people, their housing cost is their single biggest expense in their life, be that through paying rent or paying mortgage. If you own your own house outright, you don't need to pay rent, you don't need to pay mortgage, and basically your costs in life are very low compared to somebody else. Now let's imagine situation changes and suddenly you lose that house, you completely lose that house, and now you still need to live, but you don't own your house. Your costs will massively increase because you have to pay rent for a whole house, or you have to pay a mortgage on a whole house. So if you own your house, your expenditures in life are much lower than if you don't own your own house. Now keep this example in mind, and we're going to start thinking about the government. So I talk a lot on this channel about increases in inequality of wealth. And what I say very often is that there are two groups in society who are losing their wealth. That is ordinary working families like you, unless you're very rich, and the government. And both of these groups have lost their wealth significantly. Now, of course, if you're an ordinary family, especially if you're a young person from an ordinary family, it will be very visible to you that ordinary families are losing their wealth because you'll be probably struggling to buy a home, or you may be in a situation where you think you can never buy a home compared to older generations who could buy property. But the loss of government wealth is often a lot less visible because we are not the government, we don't think about what the government owns. So I went to a talk by famous French inequality economist Thomas Piketty, of whom I'm quite a big fan, a few years ago when I was at Oxford, and he showed us a graph which I still remember today, and we're going to show you that graph now, which basically shows you government wealth holding. So what you can see in this graph is that all of the countries in this graph, the wealth holding of governments has decreased significantly over time. So that one line at the top is China. You won't be surprised, the Chinese government, it's essentially a communist country, the government owns a lot of the wealth in the country. The other countries on the graph are all Western countries, so you've got the USA on there, UK in there, Germany, Japan, I think France is on there. And the story of the rest of these countries is basically all the same. The wealth holding of the government has decreased significantly over time. And I want you to notice that in the case of both the UK and the US, that number went below 0% in the sort of early 2010s, so the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. So what that means is the total wealth of the UK government, the US government, and basically every other Western government is in a pretty similar situation, is now below zero. So that means these guys have debts bigger than their assets. So now note that that graph ends in 2014. the situation during COVID got significantly worse. So now these graphs will drop down significantly. And what you will see is significant negative wealth holding for the British government, for the American government, basically every Western government. Now I want you to remember the story I told you about you and your house. Because Western governments, including the British and American governments, are basically in this situation. Back sort of 50 years ago, Western governments had a lot of wealth. They essentially owned their own house. Now, of course, when we talk about governments, it's not just housing. We're talking about governments owning things like hospitals, like schools. But of course, in the case of the UK government did own also a significant amount of housing back in the 70s. And governments have lost this wealth now. So governments are in the same situation basically as you would be if you lost your home. So governments, they provide in the West a lot of services, education, healthcare. They used to provide housing for the poorest people in the countries. And they were able to do this because they owned the wealth. They owned hospitals, they owned schools, they owned housing. And what we learned from that Piketty graph that I showed you is that basically Western governments do not own any wealth anymore. And the fact that the number has dropped below zero means that not only do they not own wealth, they're actually in a significant amount of debt. So what does that mean, right? Governments still need to provide you with healthcare, but they don't own the hospital. Governments still need to provide you with education, but they don't own the school. Governments still need to provide the poorest people in society with housing, but they don't own the homes. Now, things like healthcare and education are never very cheap to provide anyway. You need to pay for doctors, you need to pay for teachers, but they're a lot cheaper to provide when you own the buildings. If you don't own the building, then you need to pay rent on the building. If you have a massive amount of debt, then you need to pay interest on that debt. So now governments are in situations, just as you were in. Previously, they didn't need to pay that rent, they didn't need to pay that debt interest, and now they've got to pay it. What that means is, if they want to provide you with the same level of service that they used to provide you with 30, 40, 50 years ago, they simply need more tax money because they no longer own the assets and they need to pay rent or interest on those assets. So I think this is a really important thing for you to understand, and it really completely explains the situation that we are in. The reason that governments are having to charge much higher levels of tax to provide much worse levels of service is quite simply because governments are much, much poorer now. Governments are really poor. I mean, governments are rich. They have what you could call, in modern lingo, passive income. They own the property, they don't need to pay for the property, and they can use those passive incomes to provide you with government services. Governments are no longer rich, governments are now very poor. They need to rent everything they use, they need to pay interest, and that means they've taken that money from you, and despite taking more money from you, they can't provide services. That is what happens when you go from being rich to being poor. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem if the assets which the government has lost, the wealth which the government has lost, were held by ordinary families. So, one thing I want you to realise is this loss in government wealth, these assets, these hospitals, these schools, they have not disappeared, they're all still here. These assets must have gone to somebody. And if those assets had gone to ordinary people, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem. I think the best example to illustrate that is the council housing, right? So when council housing was sold off in sort of the 80s and the 90s, the people who benefited from that initially were the people who lived in the council houses. And council houses were given to poorer people, so it benefited the poorer people. Now, the government didn't have the homes, but the people who needed the housing owned their own homes. So it wasn't initially a problem. If it was just a transfer of wealth from the government to the people, then it wouldn't necessarily matter because the people would be richer now, they could pay more taxes, or the government wouldn't need to provide so many services because you directly would own things like your own homes. The problem that we have is that actually in the last 30, 40 year period in which you have seen governments have massively lost their wealth, we have also seen a significant loss of wealth in ordinary families. And I think this is something I talk about a lot on the channel, but it is most visible in two things. Number one, the massively decreased home ownership rates for young people. Here in this country and in the US, ordinary families, their wealth tends to be in housing. So if younger people are not getting housing, it's a sign that families are losing their wealth. And number two, the massively increased debt levels for ordinary families, especially families who manage to get a mortgage. So I think this creates a kind of interesting and confusing paradox, right? Which is, how can it be possible that government has lost its wealth and ordinary families have lost their wealth? You know, the government gave, for example, the council housing to ordinary families. Now you have a situation where both ordinary families and governments are struggling to get housing. And I think this reveals the core of the problem, which is something I talk about a lot on this channel, which is that wealth which transferred initially from the government to ordinary families has over time ended up being held by the very rich. And you know, this happens to, if you want to understand the mechanism of this, you should watch the video we put out a couple of weeks ago called How You Lose Your House, which is ordinary people got this wealth from the government. They used that wealth to support their lives, to support their retirements, to pay for end-of-life care, and they ended up selling that wealth to the rich. The end situation is we end up in a place where both the government and ordinary families have very little wealth. Now it's kind of a disastrous situation, right? Because we've already learned government is struggling to provide basic services now because government is poor. What does it mean if on top of that, ordinary families are poor? Well, that means ordinary families can't afford housing, which means they really need housing. But the government, who used to have housing, doesn't have housing either, so they can't provide you with housing. It also means that people are living lives of greater poverty, they will live in worse conditions, they will live in worse housing, they will eat worse diets, they will have more stress, they will probably face more crime, which means they'll need more healthcare. But the government can't provide more healthcare because the government has no assets. So I think this really makes real the problem that I talk about a lot on this channel. So people who watch for a long time will know I'm very, very worried about growing inequality of wealth. And I think people have become used to the idea that inequality is a social problem. They're used to kind of people on the left arguing that we need less inequality because it's unfair, it's not good for society. My worry is deeper than that. My worry is that when you have very high levels of inequality, what it means is you can't get basic essential needs like housing and healthcare and education. You know, in our economy, we have a distribution of resources. If both governments and ordinary families are losing their wealth, that wealth is going to the super rich, and we've seen a ton of statistics which show us that the super rich have enormously increased their wealth in the last 3 years. You know, we had the biggest ever one-year rise of wealth by the super rich in the first year of COVID. If we give all of the resources to the rich, if we bankrupt both ordinary families and the government, the consequence is your family can't get a house, your family can't get healthcare, your family can't get education, and the government won't be able to provide them because they are also poor. So I think once you recognise that that is the problem, that governments have lost their wealth and therefore they can't provide services, the only option that they appear to feel they have is to tax the middle class, who are also losing their assets, you realise that the fundamental question here and the only real way to solve this problem is to get the assets back, basically. And that doesn't necessarily mean increasing the size of government. It could mean transferring assets back from the very rich to the middle class, to the working classes. And the fundamental question is, how do you get those assets back, you know? And I think if you want to address that question, how do you get the assets back, it is very helpful to consider yourself from the position of a wealthy person. So consider you are like a rich person, but not a super rich person. So say you've got a net wealth of £5 million, which is of course a lot, but the very rich have much, much more than that. If you have a net wealth of £5 million, let's assume you're able to make 5% a year on that £5 million. You might make a bit less. 5% of £5 million is £250,000 a year. Let's assume you make a bit less, £200,000 a year. This is passive income. You get this on top of your work. You don't need to do any work to get it. You're making £200,000 a year. How much money would you spend? Imagine you suddenly had a passive income of £200,000 a year. You know, the ordinary person probably spends £20,000, £30,000 a year. I suspect you probably raise your spending to £60,000 a year, maybe £70,000 a year, which would massively improve your lifestyle. And you still have another £130,000 a year passive income, which you could use to buy more assets. Now, in a strong economy that's growing rapidly, you might be able to use this money to create more assets. But we don't live in a strong economy that's growing rapidly, we haven't for some time. You're probably going to use this money to buy existing assets, probably from the middle class, probably from the government. But the big problem you have here, you will never sell your assets, will you? If you have £5 million in assets, you've got 160 grand a year passive income, which you use to grow your assets, you will never ever sell your assets. So if we exist in an economy which is not really growing, the rich will never sell their assets. Not only that, they will continue to buy more assets. You can see that it is already and will become increasingly impossible for the government or for you as an ordinary family to ever get any of your assets back. So, this is the situation we are in. Government is taxing you a lot to pay for shitty services because government's bankrupt. And you can't afford to pay those taxes because ordinary families are bankrupt. And all of that wealth is gone to the rich who are going to use it to buy the rest of the wealth, making you even more bankrupt. And this essentially is the reason why what I always campaign for is significantly higher taxes on the very rich, because I don't see any other way of you getting your assets back. And I want to talk a little bit about how this could work, how we could make this society better. I think the only way you get wealth flowing the other direction, you tax very rich people much, much more. You use that money to significantly reduce taxes on working people. Your taxes are less, so you start to be able to accumulate a bit of money. Rich people's taxes are much, much more, so they need to sell their assets in order to pay for the taxes. You've got more money, the rich need to sell assets. You, ordinary working families, can start to buy those assets back from the rich. So the reason I support higher taxation on the rich is because, number one, it's the only way to reduce your taxes. And number two, it's the only way for you, ordinary families, to get your assets back. The point I want to make here is, when I talk about taxes, we're in an interesting place here in society where, understandably, the middle class is getting quite heavily taxed. Largely because the rich pay very low taxes. And if you haven't watched it, I would encourage you to watch our video, Who Pays Tax? Because the very rich often pay very, very low rates of tax. And that has led to a situation where ordinary people, and particularly like slightly higher earning people, middle class people, are very opposed to tax. And yet tax is essentially the only way that they will ever get richer. So ordinary people have been put in a situation where, for very understandable reasons, they oppose the only possible policy measure which could save them from poverty. And I think, this is supported by ideas like tax is wasted, like tax is corrupt, like tax goes to a corrupt government. Taxing the rich can be used to lower your taxes, and that is the only way that you can get your assets back from wealthy people. If we don't tax them, they will continue to never sell any assets, have enormous amounts of passive income, which they and their kids will use to outcompete you and your kids for the assets which you currently own, and in the end your family will own nothing. So listen, tax for me it's not about increasing the size of government, it's not about more levels of government spending. Tax for me is about defending ordinary families from the growing power and wealth of the rich. It's about getting wealth back into the hands of ordinary people. And it's about making life better, or at the very least, stopping life from getting worse. So to conclude, I would like to make the clear point that the only way to reduce the tax burden for you, for ordinary families like you, is to increase taxes. But to increase taxes on the rich.
Africa, historically, sub-Saharan Africa, has been fundamental to the global prosperity of the advanced countries. Okay? And Africa had a role to play. It has a role as a raw material producer. We will not allow sub-Saharan Africa to escape that. Okay, we do everything to keep sub-Saharan Africa where it is, also impoverished. It's absolutely vital for the prosperity of everyone else. So let's get clear about that. Okay, and this means all the economic structures, all the global institutions, and the economics we teach everyone is all designed to keep Africa exactly where it is.
Who's the ugly child?
That one.
Show me the dumb child.
Dumb child.
Okay, why is she the dumb child?
Because she has black skin.
Okay. Show me the bad child. Why is he the bad child?
Because he's really dark.
Show me the dumb child. Why is she the dumb child?
Because she looks black.
Show me the good child. Why is she the good child?
Because she looks whiter.
And if I can, take a moment. The reason for it, the reason you're outraged because data don't count or that data aren't there.
And I am.
And you are, and you said you were. Let me give you a different explanation of why you are. For me, this is all about capitalism, of which I'm a critic, so won't surprise you. But I'm particularly critical of capitalism because of the industry called advertising, which has been flourishing in capitalism in a way it never did in any other system ever before. What do I mean by advertising? An entire industry employing millions of people whose job I would describe as follows. You take a product that a client wishes to sell, a good or a service, and your job is to publicize everything positive about it that you can think of, and add a few imaginary positives that you can think of, and attach them to the object. And at the same time, go out of your way to hide and deny every negative about it. And this becomes the norm for discourse in a society. You are teaching every child who watches television, whether he or she could say it, be conscious of it, cognize it or not, is learning. I am being told only good things about orange soda pops. No one ever tells me anything. In school, they say you should approach things by looking at the pros and the cons, weighing the good parts and the bad parts. You're supposed to come to a balanced understanding of but the relentless power of advertising, which gets you much more than the classroom teacher or the nice minister or the loving parent. They're teaching you that's all bullshit. You know what it's really about? Hammering at you. The positive. There are no negative. There are no negative. Then all to my product are just these positives. Guess what our politicians do? They tell you only about their positives, and they hide their negatives. There are no negatives. My opponent invents the negatives. I'm just positive. It's so childish that people see through it, thinking they are not infected by it. But you are. Just like your 4-year-old watching television is being taught that discourse is what the ancient Greeks called rhetoric, speech designed to get an outcome, not speech designed to understand. In the ancient Greeks understood the difference. Americans don't get it.
What we don't want to acknowledge in America is that rights and democracy are now a function of how much money you have, full stop. The wealthy technocrats and the 0.1% feel as if, and quite frankly, it may be true, that they are protected by the law, but not bound by it. Whereas the rest of the 99% are bound by the law, but not protected by it.
I know I said I'm not gonna speak anymore, but you've listened now to what those guys have to say. Now I just want us to go over again what Uncle Rob is talking about in this particular video and then give my comments on it, right?
Let's not blame Enoch. We need to blame Cyril. Cyril is the real villain behind South Africa's budget disaster. South Africa is on the brink of financial collapse, and there's one man to blame, Cyril Ramaphosa. Not the finance minister, not the coalition partners, but the so-called great deal maker himself. Yeah, right. Cyril has been missing in action while the economy crumbles, and it's time we call him out. So let's look at the facts. The budget speech, a cornerstone of governance, was delayed in an unprecedented blunder. Why? Because the ANC-led coalition couldn't agree on the numbers 2 hours before it went live. South Africa's growth is at 0.8%, and the forecast is a pathetic 1.8%, lower than Britain.
Now, again, based on the GDP growth, like many of you capitalists have an interest in, make it make sense that the elites, their wealth is growing at a greater rate than that of the government, that of the country as a whole, right? And again, we live in a finite, in a vacuum with a finite amount of resources, right? So take this circle as the whole. Now to the side, right? This is the amount of resources, you know, that the Stellenbosch Mafia has, you know. And when I say Stellenbosch Mafia, it includes Rob HERSOV and the other billionaires in our country, right? So now, as Gary explained, from here, they are already making passive income based on their wealth, right? So the only thing they can do to spend money on is to buy more of the assets and resources, right? Us who do not have this generational wealth, these multi-billions, we do not have the capacity to acquire any resources, to acquire the assets, right? So they are gonna own it more and more and more. Eventually, they will end up owning everything. Then we end up not being able to participate in the economy anymore because we don't have money to participate in it. And when they don't have people who can buy their products and services, then their wealth becomes null and void and loses all its value. Because this economy only has value as long there is movement of money. Alright? And the way the current system is set up is the richer you are, the more you are hoarding monies. Alright? And the poorer you are, the less you are able to hoard money. You are not able to save because you need to spend to survive. Alright? And our current system don't have any mechanism in place for an overspill. Alright? For them who now own all the resources to make it come back in whatever mechanism, shape or form back to the masses so that the masses can spend again, empowering their companies, their corporations.
During its economic meltdown in 1976. Government spending continues to rise while tax revenues shrink. The top taxpayers already fund 25% of personal income tax, and now they want a wealth tax. On top of that, the country is drowning in debt, with borrowing escalating to cover bloated public sector wages and failing state-owned enterprises. Madness. Corruption, inefficiency, and vanity projects drain state funds while businesses suffocate under red tape and crumbling infrastructure. Well done, ANC. The ANC is living in a fantasy where they think they can tax and spend their way out of a crisis. Public spending is out of control, and redistribution is prioritized over wealth creation.
Now, just on that point, Uncle Rob, redistribution is prioritized over wealth creation. Again, here is where I say Uncle Rob lacks the intellectual capacity to think critically. Because if he understands that this universe operates on laws, he will understand that here is where the law of conservation comes into place. Right? Is that energy cannot be destroyed or created. It can only be transformed from one form to another. Right? So, technically, we can't create new wealth. We can only redistribute the existing wealth there is. So, for people who will take this as fact, where he says that we must prioritize wealth creation, you already do not comprehend the reality you are existing in. You are already not able to understand the laws that govern your existence. So we are not able to create new wealth. We can only redistribute what God has created already. We are not God to create something out of nothing. So the idea that we can create new wealth, please, only a person without brains will fall for that nonsense.
Typical ANC. The environment is increasingly hostile to businesses and wealth creators, pushing capital and talent out of the country. The ANC refuses to take responsibility. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana was thrown under the bus. But
again, you are saying the ANC is refusing to take responsibility, when you very well know it is you and the people in your league that is preventing real policies that can bring about the necessary change. Instead, you are the ones keeping your boot on the neck of the ANC. And now you scapegoating the blame from yourself to the ANC. And all people who consider themselves capitalists, you are all part of the problem. And again, please make it make sense, people who consider themselves Christians, that you are a Christian and a capitalist. I don't think you understand either one of those two's definition, because the one cancels the other out. Because what it means to be a Christian is to care and love your neighbor as you do yourself. In a capitalist society, it is the survival of the fittest. Now tell me, how does those two can be considered the same characteristics for one person? No, man. You lack the ability to think critically when you believe you can be a Christian and you can be a capitalist.
Ramaphosa is the real culprit, and the coalition, the government we have, was supposed to introduce stability, but instead it has become a circus of indecision and incompetence. If South Africa doesn't course correct now, an IMF bailout is inevitable. We need a full change of direction. And why aren't more people talking about this? How long before South Africa becomes a full-blown failed state?
Uncle Rob, people are talking about this. Here I am talking about this. It is your ears that is unable to register or unwilling to process and register the information that we share regarding this failing financial system, this failing economic system. You do not see how it's killing you as a capitalist as well. The system devours everything and everyone. You know why? Because it prioritizes a profit over sustainability, over life, over the health of this planet. The system's main objective is to devour everything within it for the sake of a profit.
Like our northerly neighbor. And what happens when the tax base finally collapses and there's no one left to foot the bill? This is not just another budget failure. It's a sign that the ANC has no plan, no vision, and no capacity to lead. The path forward is actually simple. Enoch, stop the reckless spending and scrap non-essential government departments like the Department of Small Business Development.
Now, listen to that hypocrisy. And many of you capitalists, many of you subscribers of Rob HERSOV, who praised him in the comment section when he made these statements, you are not able to think critically that he's contradicting himself, complaining that South Africa is not a very business-friendly environment, while he is saying with the same breath that they need to cut non-essential entities like small business development. So how can you want to cry for a business-friendly environment and also ask at the same time for business development to be cut? Does these thoughts not cross your mind when you hear these contradicting statements? Or is your brain conditioned to the extent where critical thinking is unable to return?
Half our overseas embassies. Cut corruption, enforce accountability, and privatize the failing state-owned enterprises. How often do
Privatize the failing state enterprises. Again, like you heard Gary shared, what history have shown, again, where Mr. Wolf shares with you the era where the Soviet Union, at the end of the communist era, they immediately jumped into capitalism. And capitalism did not benefit the country as a whole. Only the elite benefited, and this is when these economists, not referring to Gary and Mr. Wolf, I'm referring to those capitalists and the economists who studied to become economists but unable or unwilling to change or not able to recognize the problems in the system. Right? These capitalists, they fail to take this information into account, that capitalism did not work. We can see today in America, it prides itself as the richest country in the world, but 1% of its population owns all the wealth, while 99% lives in poverty. So who is benefiting from this economy? This system is not meant to benefit all people.
do we have to say that? Reduce tax burdens and simplify regulations to make South Africa an attractive place for investment and entrepreneurship. If nothing changes, South Africa will be forced into IMF control, losing its economic sovereignty. Maybe that's not a bad thing. But if we act now, there's still time to turn this around and for South Africa to become a thriving, investment-friendly economy. Wouldn't we?
South Africa is already in a Stellenbosch mafia control. So what is your point? And the Stellenbosch mafia is already foreign to this country because it's not indigenous. It's a colonial power. So if South Africa loses power to the IMF, what the fuck is the difference? Because already the power is not in the hands of the people. The people do not have any influence on this economy except their buying power that is diminishing by the moment.
We like that. We like that. We like that. Spineless Cyril needs to stop hiding and start leading. South Africa needs economic reforms, not political excuses. And whether Cyril likes it or not, time is running out.
Yeah, so some of these so-called intellectuals, capitalists, right? They say that when we are unable to argue a valid point, then we start to insult. So I'm going to apply that now to Uncle Rob over here. Right? He is unable to argue a valid point, and now is reverting to calling the president spineless Ramaphosa. Not that I disagree with that statement. I'm just highlighting now he's starting to insult. Right? And with the same breath, I want to say, Uncle Rob, you talk a klomp kak. You spew a whole lot of kak, and you lack intellectual capacity. And if it's not that you lack intellectual capacity, then you have an agenda that is excluding 99% of the people in this country. Right? So you have no desire for a rainbow nation. Right? Because you only want capitalist and a capitalist system to be implemented and to be recognized and to thrive in this country. Right? Not once do you speak to us, the average person on the ground, who has no influence but being a consumer in this economy, who has no power to contribute. Like, we are constantly told that we have equal opportunity, apartheid is gone. When you know for a fact that the system is based on capital, and we do not have access to capital. So we are already excluded from the starting line. So where are we included? Uncle Rob, please explain that to me. Because clearly you're not speaking to us. You're speaking to your type, to your people, the elite, the owners of the economy. And then you manage somehow to convince those of us here on the floor, on the ground, who do not have the influence that you do, that we also might be able to do it. And that it's our own fault if we are not able to achieve it. Please, man. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are regarding my suggestion to have this economy scrapped altogether and start with a new system. And as I suggested, referring to it as a resource management system that excludes money, because it is money that is the tool that is allowing these elite to extract value from you, to extract power from you, to extract your rights from you and put all the power in their hands. Make them the controllers and owners of your destination or your destiny in this country, or not just this country, in the world. Because yes, people are gonna say, I can't compare, like they tell Gary, you can't compare the United Kingdom's economy with the American economy, when we all are operating on the same system. Same system. So the outcome is the same across the globe. And again, I'm gonna make this analogy again. Why people struggle to understand when I speak about this economy that needs to be demolished. Let's use an example of Google. Right? Before Google, we had to search for stuff on the internet, and we used the term search. And then Google as a search engine came along. Google as a search engine was so popular that we started using the name of Google as a term to substitute the term search. So now we don't search stuff on the internet anymore. We Google stuff on the internet. Right? Even when we use ChatGPT, some of us still speak in this manner. Let me go Google on ChatGPT what ChatGPT says. Right? Similarly, in our trading system, before the economy, we had a bartering system. Right? This economy became so popular, then now we can only conceive of trading in this form of the economy. Right? So whenever we want to make a reference to trade, we say that is the economy or economic activity. Right? That term has replaced trading. So again, I'm saying we need to get rid of the term economy and the whole system of economy, and especially the term, because if you're going to use the term again, a resource management economy, it's not going to work because of how our brains have been conditioned. And again, I'm going to put in a small video here to make a comparison how our brains function like computers.
Now, to start hacking on the operating system, your first entry point is the shell, which is a program that exposes the operating system to the end user. It's called a shell because it wraps the kernel. It takes a line of text as input and produces an output. This is called a command line interface. Not only can it connect to your own computer, but with the secure shell protocol, it can also connect to remote computers over a network. Now that you have access to the mainframe, it's time to pick a programming language, which is a tool that uses the abstraction principle to make computers practical to work with for humans by simplifying different systems layer by layer. Some languages like Python are interpreted. That means there's a program called an interpreter that will execute each line of code one by one.
The thought processes that happens in our thinking is similar to how the computer executes code line by line. First it has to execute this line, then it has to execute this line, so on and so forth. If it skips lines, it's because there's a function in there that makes it to skip lines. Alright? Now similarly, that is how our thinking goes, and here is when I want to appeal to the religious people, so that you can look at the Bible and understand it with a computer science concept as well.
Sometimes your code will simply do something which is known as a statement. A good example is the if statement, which handles conditional logic. For example, if the condition is true, it will execute this code, otherwise it will short circuit and run the code inside of the else block. Another very common type of statement is a loop. A while loop will run this block of code over and over again until the condition in the parentheses becomes false.
You are trapped in this religion thinking of yours. Right? Because of stuff like for loops and while loops. As soon as your brain starts to think critically, yeah, but this statement is cancelling this statement, so this is where this Bible is contradicting itself. There's a verse that brings you back and shows you, but no, Christianity is the right way. You must repent. You must accept that Jesus died for you. And here's the thing, when they say Jesus died for our sins, only one of the two can be true. Was Jesus murdered for the statements he made? Or did he come to die for our sins? Both can't be true. Because in the one hand, we are told that Jesus was murdered for the statements he made. And on the other hand, we are told he came to sacrifice himself for our salvation. Only one of it can be true, and here is where people who lack critical thinking will be unable to grasp that. And when they say God loves you unconditionally, why must you repent? Why must you fear God? Can't you see that repenting and fearing God are conditions? So if you have to repent, if you have to fear God, then God don't love you unconditionally. Because there are two conditions already. For God to love you, you must repent and you must fear Him. Now, make it make sense when you say God loves you unconditionally. Do you understand the definition of unconditionally? That means to say that you can murder all the people in the world. God will still love you. Because He don't care what you do. He just loves you. That is unconditional love. And I don't think any of us have the capacity, not even God, if you believe you have to repent, then not even God can love unconditionally. And I am one to believe He loves us unconditionally. I believe we do not have to repent. I believe we do not have to fear. Because if the Bible tells us He loves us unconditionally, then that means to fear Him, to repent, was inserted by humans into this text. And again, I'm rambling a whole lot of nonsense. Hopefully some of you, it sticks. Hopefully it makes some of you start to think. And what I want to get out of this is to start a process of engagement. How do we get rid of this economic system? How do we go about setting up the system God already created that functions by laws? How do we transition into that system? And what does that system look like? And again, here is where many of you gonna disagree. We are not supposed to work for food, for clean drinking water, or for shelter. Those three must be a given in this new system. It must be a given. Because all of us come with nothing into this reality. So whoever decided that you must pay to be able to have access to food, you must pay to have access to water, you must pay to have access to shelter, they are the devil. And the devil again is the people who lack knowledge. The devil is not a person or a spirit or entity like me or you who is conscious. The devil is you, the person who lacks knowledge. Because a person with the correct knowledge is gonna act and address and, how can I say now, conduct themselves in a manner which God intended, because they have the correct knowledge. So I believe people like Rob can be classified the devil, because number one, either he lacks the knowledge or he is in possession of the knowledge but with an agenda is trying to withhold us, the rest of you, to gain access to that knowledge. And again, in one of the videos I watched in this week, a statement made by a psychologist is that we as humans do not have any grasp of understanding of anything when we come into this world. It is only when in when language is introduced to us with definitions of terms, now we are able to conceive of certain concepts and understand them. And these people are using a language to confuse you. And if you are unable to discern for yourself what is fact and what is fiction, then you will be a victim of their agenda. This has now gone on too long. I want to end this one here because, you know, once you talk too much, people's brains start to shut down. So this has been Marshall for Wake Us Up in the Hood. I will catch you in the next one. Peace.
No society wants you to become wise. It is against the investment of all societies. If people are wise, they cannot be exploited. If they are intelligent, they cannot be subjugated. They cannot be forced in a mechanical life to live like robots. They will assert their individuality. They will have the fragrance of rebellion around them. They would like to live in freedom. Freedom comes with wisdom, and no society wants people to be free. The communist society, the fascist society, the capitalist society, the Hindu, the Mohammedan, the Christian, no society would like people to use their own intelligence, because the moment they start using their intelligence, they become dangerous. Dangerous to the establishment, dangerous to the people who are in power, dangerous to the haves, dangerous to all kinds of oppression, exploitation, suppression, dangerous to the churches, dangerous to the states. In fact, a wise man is a fire, alive, a flame. He would like rather to die than to be enslaved.